If you're a startup founder and you are pitching for equity, capital, and funds, then market sizing is going to be one of the most important things that you're able to talk about.
So you can't serve the companies that can't deploy your technology. So you could take the TAM and then figure out which companies can deploy your technology in the way that you deploy it.
And I'm really excited because today we're going to talk to the founder of Quantics Research, Theresa Bolmarcich, who is an expert in market sizing. And she is going to walk us through in a very comprehensive way how to compute the TAM-SAM, SOM, and we'll talk about what those are.
Well, first, you need to know what your market is. So you have a product, but you need to start with your market thinking.
And really have the kind of market sizing that will let your investors know that you really know what you're talking about and your business has a ton of potential. So let's get into it. Theresa, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, John, for inviting me. I'm super excited to talk about market sizing. I'm a person that gets excited about research.
Yeah, well, let's dive in. So, well, first of all, let's talk about like what do we even mean by market sizing? Because that's the first thing that's like not everybody understands what it is. And usually for an investor, it's one of the things they use to kind of separate someone who understands what they're doing in terms of running a startup versus those that are just kind of dabbling. So let's start with just what do we even mean by that?
Well, first, you need to know what your market is. So you have a product, but you need to start with your market thinking. And market thinking really matters because it sets the boundaries. And when you give a number and say the market's this size, your investors want to know, well, what is the market? So that's a really important first step.
Yeah. So what when we say market size, like what would be an example of a market size?
Well, for example, some of the market sizing I've done is mostly for B2B tech companies. So you might say the market size for customer support software is $13 billion. I'm just making up numbers right now. But that depends on the geography that you're associating it with, the company size that you're associating it with. And a markets view really helps you understand where your revenue exists right now, where you could go if that market becomes exhausted, so you can jump to an adjacent market. And it also helps you understand how to operationalize your company so that you can grab the market that you want.
Interesting. And so it's a dollar amount. It's a value.
Yes.
It's like somehow that, whatever it's like maybe industry or sector might be some things we talk about. It's like it's a dollar amount. It's maybe money being spent in a particular category. Is that a good way to say it?
Yeah, there's a couple different methods to market sizing, and one of them really counts up the number of dollars that are being spent in the market. And another one actually helps you calculate, and we call bottom up, it's my favorite, how many customers you can go after. And that's really great if you do it both ways, and it's very convincing for investors. So I would recommend doing both, which we're going to walk through today.
Yeah, for sure. And the other thing I would say is, one of the methods or the concepts that you'll be talking about today is TAM, SAM, and SOM. And I've done some videos on that in the past. It's something I teach in my courses. And it's one that, I think, those that are learning about it struggle with at first. Before we get into like some of the different ways you might do it, the bottom up, top down, all those kinds of things, maybe just introduce that concept a little bit. And what do we mean when we say TAM, SAM, SOM? It sounds like a very kind of a funny word or phrase. Walk us through that.
Yeah, well, the TAM, TAM stands for total addressable market, and that's really all the possible demand for your product. So that's your full market category. And that, as an example, I would say the market for nail polish, right? That would be anybody possible that would want to buy nail polish. Then the SAM is the service addressable market. So maybe you have a particular type of nail polish, maybe a gel nail polish, and there's only a particular part of the market that likes that kind. So what happens is your total addressable market, because of the actual product that you're offering, is going to be reduced to the people that are likely to buy that particular flavor of what you're selling. And then the most important part is your SOM, which is the service opportunity market. And this is really what your company can achieve. And that's based on your channel partners, the number of salespeople you have. So, just to review, while TAM is the total possible market, the SAM is really the reachable market for you, and the SOM is really what's realistic. How much revenue can you generate?
Yeah. So let's maybe just run a quick example of that. Like you mentioned the nail polish example. What would be at a high level? What would a TAM be for nail polish?
What would a TAM be for nail polish? I am not sure, but I will talk later about how we could find out that number. I do know that there's about 34,000 nail polish salons in the United States. And so you'll notice I'm saying
Wow.
United States. So one of the things we just talked about is you have to say, what geography am I going to do business in? Right. And then
Yeah.
you'll have to find out based on the geography what amount of revenue is being generated. And then also, how many customers could you potentially sell to?
Yeah, interesting. And so if we were gonna calculate nail polish based on that, you might say there's 30,000 salons, average nail polish use in each salon is X, and then, and bound by the geography of the United States and that total spend, that might be an example of at least part of a TAM, right? Let's talk about the differences there. Like what so top
Right.
down, bottom up, I think we have an image that, kind of shows there's a little bit of a hierarchy here, or sometimes I see
Mhm.
these as concentric circles.
Mhm.
What would be the difference between if you were gonna calculate top down versus bottom up?
Well, sure. The most common way I see the top down done is you take the competitive set, meaning who are you going to compete with in this market? They have to do the same job as your job that you're doing. So jobs to be done. So if they're doing the same job as you for a similar set of customers, you can consider them a competitor. And then you just simply add up all the revenue that they're generating for the market. Now, the catch to that is that some of these companies are private. You don't know what their revenue is, so you have to estimate that. And then also, what can happen to you is part of the market may be owned by some major companies. I'm going to jump to a B2B tech example. So, for example, in a lot of tech industries, Salesforce has a huge chunk of the market, say, for example, in customer support. And maybe they own 30% of the market. You have to be realistic about what percent you can get. Um, the other thing about looking at your competitors and the amount of revenue they generate is a lot of people do the job that you can do with some sort of process that's, you know, just something they've done. In the tech industry, a lot of the jobs to be done were done through Excel. People were just doing it manually with Excel. So if I added up the revenue of all the competitors, it wouldn't even reflect the amount of people using a different tool that, is a multi-purpose tool. So for that reason, it can be difficult to defend your top-down estimates because there's a lot of assumptions. And even if you find the data sources, there's definitely vendors that sell reports. They can be helpful for context, but the vendor is making assumptions. And if they list their assumptions and then your investor asks you, you can reveal these are the assumptions we made. But top down is a little bit more directional. So I wouldn't stop just there. That's not as convincing.
Yeah. So then flip the scale, like if you were, you said you wouldn't stop there. Talk a little bit more about bottom up and why you would recommend that.
Okay, well, bottom up, I feel like bottom up is much more quantitatively oriented, and my orientation is much more quantitative, as you know, John. So, the bottom up starts with the customer, not the category of product, right? So, we're looking at how big is the market according to the amount of buyers that are in the market. And it's really much more useful because you can articulate the number of people you're going to actually sell to. So you take basically the full universe of potential buyers for the job to be done or the product or service you're selling. It might be people, could be households, could be businesses, um, you know, whatever that entity is that you plan to sell to, you're going to count up those people, right? or businesses or households, whatever your unit of analysis is. And there's lots of data sources out there that help you do this. There's some free ones. A lot of people start with the census, and there's some ones that you might have to pay for. But to get the total addressable market, you simply start by estimating how many people or businesses you can sell to. The next
Yeah.
step, and really top down leaves you at that point. It leaves you at the TAM. It's more difficult in top down to do a SAM and a SOM. But the bottom up will give you
Mhm.
the TAM, and then the SAM is a narrowing of the universe of the TAMs. So the way you narrow that universe is a lot of different things. I've done it two ways. In B2B tech, I've done it by, for example, maybe your product can only be deployed in the cloud. And there's lots of buyers out there that have mainframes or client servers, believe it or not, right? Um, and so you can't serve the companies that can't deploy your technology. So you could take the TAM and then figure out which companies can deploy your technology in the way that you deploy it for your particular product, and then reduce the TAM to the SAM that way. With individuals, the fun part of calculating the SAM is you have to figure out how many people are likely to buy your product, right? So that's where some primary research can come in. You can show them your concept and get an estimate of their likelihood to buy. Then use that percentage, and maybe you find 30% of all the people you surveyed are willing to purchase your product for the price that you're going to charge. So then you can apply that percentage to the TAM. So you have the total addressable market, the potential set of buyers, and then you reduce it to the serviceable market based on one of these methods of reduction. And then based on that, you start to get more realistic. You start to think about whether you're a new player in the market. Do you have the sales channels you really need? You know, is there some other competitor that owns a lot of the market and you're going to have to maneuver around them or steal their share? So the service opportunity market gives your investor a realistic number of, within this year, we've got 500 enterprise customers or that we're going to go after. And that gives them a sense that you really know what you're doing.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about, you mentioned primary research. Maybe talk about what is primary research? How is it different from secondary research? How do you use both of those in this process?
Yeah, well, I'm throwing around some research terms. Well, secondary research is when you use existing resources, industry reports, things that you can find on the internet to give you the data you need. And top down relies heavily on that. Bottom up relies more heavily on actually asking people that might buy your product if they like it. And we call that a concept test. And often you can just give them a description. If it's a product they can hold in your hands, your hand, their hands, you can show it to them. But if you just get a sense on the face value of the product, whether they be interested in it, that can give you a percentage of the market to decrease your TAM by. And primary research can
Yeah,
be done with surveys. You can do focus groups. Um, to get really specific quantitative information, you tend to do a survey. There's a lot of tools out there. SurveyMonkey, for example, is a real inexpensive or free tool that you can use. John, I'm sure you've gotten surveys from people using SurveyMonkey, right?
for sure. Yeah, in fact,
Yeah.
it's one I've used a lot, over time. I mean, I find sometimes you can go as basic as Google Forms.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, SurveyMonkey works really well. If you're wanting it to feel a little more branded in some way, JotForm, I find, is a really good tool for collecting data in a way that kind of fits in maybe with a larger brand, presence, that kind of thing. And then I've seen some of the heavier engines like Qualtrics, you
Yeah.
see a lot, in different types of research. So those are some of the ones I've seen. So lots of different ways to collect quantitative data. But I think, one thing I've also seen is I've seen some really terrible data collection efforts done with, any one of these tools, And so what are some of the things you're thinking about when you're creating that instrument to make sure that the data is useful?
Well, for market sizing specifically, I always ask a special series of questions. So I just don't want to know whether people are interested in my product. I ask them if they're interested. I ask them if they have a need at this time. and I might define the time period so they know what I'm talking about. I ask them if they think it's unique, and I'll ask them if they're likely to buy it, and then I give them a price that I would charge them essentially. And if you look at the people that make it through what I call the adoption funnel that I just described, you can really get a precise percentage of people that are likely to buy your product. So the types of questions you ask need to be more than first impressions. So you have to dig in a little bit and then use that data together. The other thing that can happen with research for startups is they don't show their concept to enough people, right? So that's why I lean
Yeah.
towards quantitative and using survey tools. A lot of these vendors that we're talking about, John, they have panels that you can buy. So for $500, you could buy a panel of respondents, and they're fairly well regulated in terms of security parameters and cleaning procedures so that you're getting good respondents. And I think it's a review culture. I think a lot of people participate in these surveys now, and it's much easier if you have the correct protocols in place to protect you from bots to get really representative samples. So I think really
Yeah.
the
So this
questions
is
you
it
ask
sounds
and the sampling you use are the most important factors to trusting the primary research.
yeah, that's really good. And so when you talk about these panels, like where would you if you said, "Okay, I wanna research this, I want this type of a profile of a person," where would you go to, buy access to a panel and that process you're talking about?
Well, if you have money, you'd go to a big panel vendor like one that I used to use in B2B tech is Danata. But if you don't have any money, SurveyMonkey, right on the website, it'll say, would you like to use our panel? And then you can specify, I want women 25 to 49 who make a household income of this much, who are in the United States, although I think SurveyMonkey is just United States. And it'll tell
Yeah.
you the likelihood that their panel has that set of people. And it'll say, do you want us to demographically weight it and balance your data? And as long as you as long as your sample size is 100, they can do that for you. And that really is the go-to source for me for real inexpensive market sizing versus going to an official panel vendor that will sell you access to their panel.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, just, there's if you're bootstrapping, SurveyMonkey, and depending on I would assume like the type of, kind of respondent you're looking for, that could be a good way to do it inexpensively. You mentioned the one that was, much more pricey. Are there any mid-range? Like, are there some that are a little more, a little higher quality, little pricier, but not maybe as much that might price some companies out?
Well, there's some very specific vendors for your field. So if you're looking at a particular consumer-based market, because remember you've defined your market, you may find a panel vendor that has access to those people. So in pharmaceutical market research, it's very difficult to get physicians to participate outside of, you can't cold call physicians, you can't cold email physicians. So there's some specialized ones there. I have pretty much used for the inexpensive studies, the SurveyMonkey panels, but lots of vendors that sell you the tool also sell you the panel. They tend to go hand in hand. Um, One of the other things is we're talking about these panels because we're, we're really talking about the SAM now. We're talking about how do we filter the TAM to get us to the SAM. But a lot of people need to really start at, how do I find a source of data for my TAM? You know, where do
Yeah.
I go to get numbers of businesses? And, where do I go to get numbers of households? And those data sources, I think we have a slide on that, are really helpful. There's population sources. If you don't want to do primary research, there's other sources about spending and behavior patterns. And that just helps you take the TAM and reduce it to something realistic. One of the biggest complaints I've heard from investors is that the founder puts a huge number in front of them, right? And it's so unrealistic. It's every geography, it's every company size they're going to sell to. And, if you show that you've given a TAM and then you also show that you've given a SAM, that's really convincing because they know you've done your homework
Yeah.
on the dynamics of the market and the adoption profile. And I think that makes it much more defensible when you identify your revenue opportunity.
Yeah. Well, and I've seen that a lot where, it's not just about knowing what the TAM, SAM, or SOM is, but it's even just the way a founder's able to talk about it. I always say, you give your pitch, but it's a Q and A is where the investors really start to figure out if, if you know what you're talking about or if you just following a prepared script and being able to articulate even how it was calculated.
Yeah.
I think I've seen people say like, we did a top down or we did a bottom up or we did a combination of both and then landed somewhere in the middle. Like even just being able to, explain that shows them that you didn't just like come up with a number. And I think the other thing, as you say, I've seen so many like the pitfall I've seen so many founders step into is they do a Google search, they find a report, and then they report like, it's usually along the lines of, well, this is a $14 billion industry. So my TAM is $14 billion. And it hasn't been vetted. The sources are questionable. It hasn't been nuanced for like what they're specifically doing. I mean, these all seem like pitfalls. Do those resonate or have you seen some others?
Yeah, you can use those kinds of sources. You just have to get a hold of the report, which sometimes they'll charge you for. If you just do a Google search or ask ChatGPT or one of the other AI engines, it's going to pop out a number. It might link you to the source. I know ChatGPT does that. I know Google does that. And then, you can check out the source and see if you can get more details on the methodology. I think that can be convincing if you say, here's what we use. It was a report based on this. And here are some of the assumptions they made. So I think that that's doable, but being able to say, hey, we counted up the number of buyers that have the problem that we're solving. We will charge each of the buyers this price, or maybe you have multiple tiers. Um, and that gives them a more realistic picture of how you actually calculated the size of the market for your specific product. So having both is a wonderful thing. The goal is not just this huge number, it's one that you can defend, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and going back to you mentioned sources for sizing. I've heard you say in the past there's kind of three big categories of sources. So maybe walk us through those, and I know there's a kind of a process then for kind of moving those sources in through what data you're trying to collect from them.
Yeah, well, again, inexpensive is the US Census. And let's just use a B2B example. If you right now, the data that's available for the US Census on businesses is 2023 data. So it's going to always be a little behind. Um, so you can get into the census easily, and there's buttons on there that you can press that'll help you understand how to use their data sets. And so once you have a
Mhm.
definition of your audience, so maybe their company size is important to you, and you want to sell to companies that have 5 to 99 employees or 50 to 99 employees, you're able to look at that in the census data um, and get a market size. So I did look up one for nail polish. And so I know that the US Census business data source says that there's 1,300 nail salons that have between, I think I put in 10 to 99 employees because that was a market I was thinking about for a
Mhm.
B2B tech product. And it'll just give you your number. So you're able to say, here's the number of businesses I can actually sell to. And then, there's data such as MRI Simmons, which you often have to pay for, or there's consumer spending surveys. All these are readily available. It just on the internet, they don't always give you all the information you need. You could use them instead of primary research, right? But if you're really stuck and you can't find a source that would help you predict how many of those nail salons would buy your product, how many are big enough, how many have enough employees to need the product, how many, are in the geography that you want, um, how many have the propensity to be offering, gel nail polish versus a regular. Behavior and spending sources can be helpful or not, but primary research is always going to let you put your solution in front of someone. Um, I think the number one goal is to triangulate your data. You can look on the internet for industry reports, find something relevant that you can see the assumptions they've made, and then find a way to count up the number of households, people, businesses that you're going to sell to. And again, I keep going back to the census because it's free. We know it's reliable and it's readily available. And even big firms like Oliver Wyman and Bain, they start with a census at times, you know? So
Mm.
it's a really good source. It's used by major consulting firms as a starting point. Now, I
Yeah. Yeah,
personally
that
have
makes well, and
used
it's like
Well, I personally have used in tech Gartner, Forrester, and IDC, and that you can get the top down from them, and that is their job to go out in the world and figure out how big tech markets is. So B2B tech can be really easy, and I think Gartner, Forrester, and IDC, if the report's really old, they actually let regular people that don't have a subscription have it, but you'd have to check me on that.
yeah. No, that's really helpful. And I know you've talked about there's kind of the four-step process. Maybe walk us through that of like the method.
Okay, so we're talking bottom up.
Well, I'm thinking in terms of like, just when you're, sizing a target audience, we talked about the consumer sources. But if you wanted to do one or the other or both, I'd say it'd be good to go through all of them if we could.
Right, right. So why don't we use our nail salon example since I've been talking about that? Does that sound good?
Sure, yeah.
All right. So say we have a tech product that is going to help nail salons do better inventory management. So the first thing we want to do in a top-down approach is try to find all the other tech companies that solve this same problem, and are selling to nail salons. So we would find a source, and I can't off the top of my head tell you what that source would be, but you could do your research on the internet and use your AI tools and come up with different companies that sell to them. Um, Having developed your product, you probably already did some research on who else competes in your market, and you just need to get access to their revenue figures or make an estimate of the revenue figures based on where they operate. And that would be your top-down method. You would just add up all the revenue that's being generated by tech vendors that do what you do in the market. Now, if you're with that method, if you're introducing a brand new innovative product, you may have to look at multiple different tech vendors that do the job that you want to do, also adjacent jobs. You might need to kind of model things together. But you can come up with a convincing set of other people that are generating revenue offering the same thing, and that would be your top down. For bottom up, with the nail
Okay.
salon example, you would do it a little bit differently. You'd still define your market like we just did with the top down. We said US based businesses, right? And you
Mhm.
would go to the census and you would look at the number of businesses that fall within the nail salon category. And there's lots of ways to identify the category, but there's SIC codes or NACI codes in it. Literally, there was one when I went and looked at it that said nail salons. So that was right, right? So I looked at the number of companies and I said, well, this total potential market might be 34,000 nail salons, but really the ones that are big enough to really need the job to do the job of managing their operational budget and the cost of goods is really, a larger nail salon. So that's where I went from 34,000 nail salons to 13,000 nail salons, right? And then I would
Okay.
simply say, when I sell that product, I'm gonna sell it for X amount. So I would just multiply those businesses by the amount that I am charging. And then if I did some primary research, I'd get a sense of how many businesses would be interested in this solution. So I might take the number of businesses times what I would charge them and then take a percentage of that. Maybe only 30% would be interested. And that way I would get
Mm,
my number of my realistic serviceable market.
okay. And so, yeah, just kinda really calling out those 5 steps. So
Mhm.
you said you went through and you said, "We define the market,"
Right.
and then in this case, count the entities, so in this case, count the number
That's
of
right.
salons. Um, calculating TAM, so that's your entities times your expected annual price or spend for all of them. And then 4th step would be narrowed to TAM to the SAM, so
Mhm.
apply that fit, and test those assumptions. And then finally, step 5, ground the SOM. So, name the reachable list through channels and capacity. So who could you actually get to? Is that a good way to
Yeah, do you
describe it?
have enough salespeople to get to every state in the United States? Probably not. You might wanna start in a county, right? Or in a region you think that looks like it's more conducive to purchasing these products, maybe an area where the small businesses are very tech savvy. So yeah, exactly those 5 steps. Define the market, count the entities, calculate your TAM, narrow it to SAM, and then ground yourself in reality as to what you can actually capture.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and that's one thing a lot of times I'll point to capacity as, a factor for a SOM. Where companies are even if they have, they can get to this space, but it's like at least in year one, well, you only have the capacity to either reach or deliver so many.
Yep.
So that, maybe constrains like how much you can really call your SOM in that first year.
Yeah,
Like that
one of
could be
the other
another
things that
another
happens, is, you know, you can use your bottom-up TAM to help an organization decide how to distribute their salespeople across the nation. So if you say in, Pennsylvania, there's this many, and in Idaho, there's this many, I've actually used the bottom-up TAM-SAM sum to help them decide to how to distribute their sales force. And that's why I said in the beginning, while top down is great for telling investors how big you believe the market is based on the competitive set, bottom up is super useful to help you understand how to pivot. If you see that the adoption rate is much higher in a state, you might put more people on it there. Or maybe you need a
Mhm.
channel relationship because that's the way you get into some of these businesses. It would allow you to understand how to maneuver.
Yeah. Yeah, it almost starts to, like, guide your operational decisions as
Yeah.
well. The other piece I think about is the, projections, like, just sales forecasts, revenue projections. Um, a lot of times, I found top down is informative to say, here's how big the market could be. But you don't really you almost like then have to go into a total different effort to then figure out what your forecasting is. And then you end up with questions of like, well, how does this tie to your market sizing? Whereas with bottom up, you've already kind of set the framework for how you would compute what the opportunity is, and then the narrative is like, here's how much of that SOM I think I can obtain in year 1, year 2, year 3, and here are the reasons why. And so it's almost like the bottom up approach to TAM-SAM SOM sets the stage to much more easily, start to build that forecast out and to be able to explain the connection between the 2.
Yeah.
What have you
I
seen
definitely
there
agree.
with
Yeah, I
that?
definitely agree. I have been involved in efforts where we've used the bottom up uh, market sizing to determine what the forecast would be. That just, if we're using the methodology we've been talking about, where I've been really pushing primary research rather than using some of these existing sources, you would
Mhm.
need to, in your survey, make sure not only you knew whether they were interested in your product and is it relevant, do they need it, is it unique to them, meaning they would probably buy it over the competitor, would they pay for it? You need to know what they would pay and what period of time they would have access to these funds. So I think that depending on how the data is going to be used, you might change the kinds of questions you ask when you filter your TAM to your SAM. And that would help you be more realistic with the forecast. But usually it's based on timing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the questions a little bit more and just dive in on that. Because you mentioned that you have a very specific sequence of questions that you like to ask. What does that sequence look like, and what are some of the data points you're looking for? How do you word the questions to make sure you're actually measuring what you think you are?
Oh, great. Okay. So if I was doing our nail salon example, and I happen to have a list somehow of all the major businesses in, let's just say, Chester County, Pennsylvania, that could potentially buy my offering because they have 5 to 99 employees. I'm just
Yeah.
choosing that. So, um, I would need a list of them, correct? And then I might ask them questions through a survey that I would send out to them, or I would identify them through a panel that I could get access to. I would explain the solution very simply, and I would ask them, are you interested? And then I might ask them on a scale
Mhm.
of 1 to 5, I'm very interested, down to not at all interested. And I would take anybody that said 4 or 5, so somewhat and very interested, and I would say, okay, that's my first bucket, so maybe that's 80%, right? Then I would ask them, um, is this relevant to a need that you currently have? Is the job to be done? They're interested, but do they have this problem right at this time period? And then say of that
Mhm.
80%, only half of those say, well, I have a problem with that right now. So then I get to 40%, right, of the TAM instead of 80. And then I might ask them, do you think this is a unique offering? And that is where when you do market sizing, most of the people drop out. And the reason I use
Mhm.
that is because you want to know how competitive your tool is in the market and just have a sense. So if the businesses you're talking to think that it's a unique offering, you're going to be more likely to grab them. So let's say of the 40% that are interested and have a need, only 30% of those think it's a particularly unique offering. So then you have a little bit more of a sense. And then you say, I'm going to charge this price. And what would you be likely on a scale of 1 to 5 to buy it? And then usually I take the people that said, I'm very likely to buy it. And then I basically, from our 30%, now we have 10% that said they're very likely to buy it. So I would take my number of businesses, 13,000, and I would take 10% of those, 1,300, and I'd say to myself, it looks like it probably can only sell at 1,300 with the offering that I've described. Is that enough? Is that enough money?
So, Teresa, now we've looked at how to size a market, just collecting data, primary research through surveys, through interviews, focus groups, also secondary research, finding data sources that are out there that can be useful, and just how to compute what a TAM-SAM SOM would look like and how to size a market. What I'd be interested to hear from you now is like, what if someone's now done all this work, they've computed it, they figured it out, how do they talk to an investor? How do they present this information in maybe a relatively short pitch? And then how do they talk about it when they go into like a Q&A session following a pitch or maybe an interaction with a potential investor?
Right. It's a great question. I think one of the first things that's going to make you different than others is I've seen startup presentations and they just give the TAM number. So even if you had a slide that had the TAM, SAM, sum, and you show that you're filtering, that's going to be a standout. In my experience, you've seen maybe more than me. So that's already going to signal to them that you know what you're talking about. And then presumably, they're going to ask you, how did you get from the TAM to the SAM to the SOM? And that's where you can explain the sources that you used, your assumptions that you made about how you defined your market and the time period that you're selling in, um, then how you went about determining how much of the TAM was accessible to you for your product, and then what you think your team can actually achieve. So I think that that's where the questions would come from, and it would be very convincing. If I was an investor, it'd be very convincing to me if you could do that.
Yeah. If you were an investor and someone just showed you, here's my TAM-SAM sum, what are some of the follow-up questions you might ask to try to get a sense for, how well they understood what they did?
Oh, I would definitely ask them, how did you get from the TAM to the SAM? Like, did you do some research? How many people did you show your concept to? I find that a lot of startups will show their concept to friendlies, about 10 to 12 of them, and then make an assumption about how many would buy. And I've seen that gone badly.
Yeah.
Having said that you did some sort of primary research actually showing at least 100 people your solution, even if it's just on a simple description of it, is going to be much more convincing. So they might ask that. They might ask whether you think that the number that you can charge is realistic, right? So given the
Mm.
competition. They're gonna ask, "Who's the competition? Who else is serving this market, and why are you different from them?" We haven't talked about competitive differentiation yet, but you need to have an answer to that as well, because that really affects what the opportunity is.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about competitive differentiation. What are some of the ways that market sizing plays into that, and how do you frame that when you're talking about market sizing and competition?
Right. Well, market sizing, if you're doing top down, it has to do with the number you come up with for the amount of revenue that's being generated in the market. But if you're doing a bottom up, it really exists within that filter of the SOM. And one of the ways, normally, when you come up with a product, you've probably done some research as to who else sells what you're selling, or maybe you have some experience yourself um, with the particular product that you eventually developed. So you definitely have to um, do research, on the internet is fine, through ChatGPT is fine, or whatever AI tool you use, and try to understand who also sells what you sell. If you can get access to their product, you might want to spend some time with their product and see how differentiated you are. Or if it's a service offering, if it's a tech service offering, a lot of times they have a trial that you could go and use. What I wouldn't recommend is posing as a buyer when you're not really a buyer and trying to get inside information from them, because that just goes against the ethics of competitive intelligence professionals. But certainly talking to people that have used the tools or the products that you're interested in is another helpful way to understand who actually is in your market.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, this is really helpful. I mean, just being able to size a market correctly, compute how big the market is, being able to articulate that to investors. Maybe what's in your thinking, like what represents a TAM that's too big or too small? Like what are some of the errors that can be made in that part of it?
Well, I think a too big TAM for most companies includes the entire world geographically. I don't think you should ever do that. Just limit your geographic region, right? Don't say the whole world. It's just impossible, especially if you're a startup, right? Now, I know there's probably stories of companies that have done that, but for the time being, if you make a small geography, then the investor's going to think to themselves, well, this is very convincing, but if they wanted to build even additional revenue, they could go outside of this market. So I would say be conservative upfront. So something that
Mhm.
is saying that you're going to sell in the whole world when you're just a startup company right now would be too big. I can't put a number on it because different markets are different sizes based on what's being charged. Um, the other thing that would be a really red flag for an investor is if the client that you're selling to, you have an unrealistic expectation about what they could actually pay. So if your tech solution for a nail salon is greater than the average revenue of a nail salon, right? Then that's not going to fly. You have to have a realistic number that you're going to charge somebody and a realistic sense of whether it's a repeat purchase. So I think red flags again would be saying, I'm going to serve the whole world, and saying that you're going to charge a price that, is not realistic at all for the purchaser.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that goes back to credibility with the investor. It, gives credence or not to your numbers if those numbers seem out of whack with what's realistic.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with the pricing, which is a whole other branch of research, they're gonna wanna know what your competitors are charging for a similar solution, and if you're way different than that, if you're way more than that, you're gonna need to have, some sort of explanation for that.
Right,
So that,
right.
again, is
Oh, that
where
makes
competitive comes in. You need to know what other people are already charging.
yeah. So you've been doing this. You've been doing market research, market sizing for decades now in industry for different, for very large companies. Now founder of Quantics Research. What is that? Tell us about Quantics Research.
Right, it's really the natural and logical conclusion to everything I've done because I've done so much, and as you know, I used to teach research methods, and, I really enjoy working with startups. I really enjoy helping them learn how to put these tools in place. So, market sizing is one thing that I can help a startup with, and I have done that for a consumer-based digital platform. But I also really like setting up voice of the customer feedback loops within startups once they get to a big enough point where they can't grassroots handle their customers. Putting in those feedback loops is another specialty of mine, and just setting up your research operations and making sure that your product team can run them easily. You don't always necessarily need a research department anymore because the tools are so sophisticated that, you just need somebody that knows what they're doing to set up the system for you, and then it runs for you. So, the reason I got into consulting is simply because I wanted to get out of the corporate environment and start really helping founders of interesting solutions. Um, and it's just really rewarding. So, I really enjoy it, and I meet a lot of people. So, that's the other good point of it.
Yeah. So if a startup founder is watching this video and they're thinking, I think I may need to start engaging Quantics, and this is the type of work I need. What are some of the questions that if it's like, if you're this, this, and this, like what would be the for someone who's watching this to say, oh, I should probably reach out and
Oh,
get some of this kind of input.
well, you would reach out through my website, which is Quantics Research altogether.com. Quantics is another company, so that's not me. But
Yeah.
I would, if you have so many customers and you all of a sudden realize that you cannot handle it the way you've been handling it, or just getting Google reviews on your product is not enough, that you need more because you want to introduce feedback into the product development loop. That would be maybe a reason you would need somebody like me. If you need somebody on your product team trained to do the research, you could reach out to me. If you want to strengthen your TAM-SAM sum or rationalize your TAM numbers, I could look at that and tell you whether I think it's defensible. So those three things, defending your TAM-SAM sum or your TAM, setting up your feedback operations or training employees that you want to continue all the research operations, are three things I can help with. So if you have any of those problems, it's quanticsresearch.com. I'm
Yeah.
happy to help.
Excellent. Well, and I would think, I mean, another thing I would think is, anyone who's getting ready to pitch for capital in a real way, that maybe doesn't have a lot of experience in market sizing or maybe doesn't have the bandwidth, which is often the case. I would think that would be another scenario where like, hey, help me like do this first one and make sure that my pitch deck actually is saying something credible, would also be a really valuable
Yeah.
resource as well.
I can do that and make alongside somebody to make sure that they can do it again themselves, rather than doing it and handing it over. I'd much rather train somebody. Here's how you go about it. Here's the sources that we used for this, because I think that's just more helpful. You brought up a really good point, though. You don't really need to do your TAM um, over very frequently. The TAM is immutable over short periods of time. So you don't have to really redo your TAM, but you will be constantly redoing your SAM and your SOM based on your product offerings for the SAM and what you get from the market in terms of adoption that's actually happening. And then the SOM based on the operations of your company. As you grow larger, you can get more of the SAM. So TAM doesn't necessarily have to be redone regularly, but the other parts of your model will have to be redone as you evolve. So,
Continuously.
mhm.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, Theresa, this has been so helpful. I would think anyone who's, getting ready to pitch or they've been pitching and they feel like they stumble on this one or they're not sure how to really even make decisions about their business operationally because they don't have a good sense of just how big the market is, the competitors, customers. I think this has really given some useful insight into how to really address this process and do it effectively. So I really appreciate you helping and just providing this insight today.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I have a question I always like to ask. And so I'll ask you, what is your favorite founder film?
My favorite founder film is The Aviator, and I actually watched it last night again because I love how he pivots so frequently, although he has an unlimited source of funding, so that is not realistic for most founders. But, if you could pivot, if you had the money, it's good to think about all the pivots. So that's what I enjoy about that film, besides that the acting is very good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and just almost like iterating, tinkering, trying things, literally crashing the plane at times and getting back up and trying again. Yeah, that failure, the resilience. As you
Mhm,
say, having unlimited resources doesn't help. It doesn't hurt either. So,
mhm. Mhm. Yeah, you're right. Sometimes
so
having unlimited resources doesn't help because you spread yourself too thin. So that's a good point. Yeah, that's an enjoyable film.
yeah,
Try
awesome.
it.
Well,
I'm
great
sure you've
example.
seen it because it's old, but you know, it's a good one.
Yeah, Hugh Hefner's, story, Leonardo DiCaprio, I thought did a nice job of, like, showing his vision and his, like, and that ability to pivot, and then also, some of the just, mental health challenges and everything else, it really,
Yeah, I was gonna say
well
that.
constructed.
Yeah, the mental health
Yeah.
challenges is another aspect of it, which could be a whole other podcast about the personalities with which you work and how to make things defensible given the different personalities of your investor group. So it's something to be aware of.
Yeah.
Different people believe different types of data. So that's a really good point that thinking about the Aviator film brings up.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Theresa, thanks so much for joining us. Really, really helpful insight, and look forward to maybe hearing from you more again in the future.
All right, happy to help.
All right, keep going.